Hey, you all. I am Michelle Culver. I'm the founder of the Reinvention Lab at Teach for America, where we wake up every day asking ourselves, how do we transform ourselves in service of transforming learning? And I have to say, I am really pleased to join you all. The very last trip I made before the pandemic was to India to visit and be a part of the Teach for India and KER's immersive experience. And the last few years have been profoundly different for me as a result of being inspired by your youth leaders and the leadership I saw across so many different communities when I was visiting. So my hope is to gift you a little bit back about what's been inspiring me and what's on my heart and mind here in the U.S. I'm calling in from my home in Denver, Colorado. And this is a recording because of time zones, but I invite you to be in conversation with me afterwards, and I'll share my email for those of you who want to share questions, ideas, things that this might spark in this conversation. So I hope that this can be a bit more multi-directional than this recording will allow. So we're going to jump right in, and today's focus for this conversation is thinking about what is possible for reimagining the role of educators in our schools. And I come into this conversation with this metaphor. It has shaped my own approach to education right now pretty considerably. This is the Bay Bridge in San Francisco, California. And you can see on the left, there is this old bridge. It had been built many years ago, and a friend of mine was observing the renovations of the creation from an old bridge into this new bridge. And what was important about this, and why you'll see how it's shaped my thinking about education, is that that old bridge has to work. Every day, hundreds of cars go back and forth on that bridge. They rely on it to go see family, to go to their school, to go to their jobs, for tourism. That bridge has to work. And yet it's clear it had become outdated. It was no longer up to the modern code, and it wasn't safe, actually. So the way they tended to this was to do two things simultaneously. One is just support the current bridge because it has to work, and even if it wasn't designed for today's needs, they needed it to be able to be productive. So they basically supported it, and simultaneously they had a different group of people, of engineers, who worked on the creation of the new bridge. And then piece by piece, you can see they responsibly moved the cars from one side to the next without ever stopping the flow of traffic. I invite you to start this conversation with me today to reflect on the state of education through a similar lens. You know, we know that education today was designed well over 100 years ago at a time where we never thought that girls, or at least in this country, kids of color, would be able to grow up and lead and contribute to the workforce. It was designed at a time where they were trying to build a working class for the Industrial Revolution. And in our country, it was also built on an agrarian calendar. I don't know if you all have summers off like we do, but those things are no longer the needs of today, and they do not serve our young people. And so our bridge is really outdated. And in fact, I would say there are storms around it, putting even more and unprecedented pressure on that old bridge. And so there's two things that we have to do. One is simultaneously make sure that we prop it up in order to ensure that kids today who have only that year in that grade get the education they need, and still simultaneously design something radically new to meet the needs that we now face as different from 100 years ago. So with that, I'm going to point us to the creation of a new bridge and asking ourselves, how do we respond to this moment by thinking not just about how do we improve and prop up our current system, but how might we design what we actually really want? And one of the things that are happening in this country, we're now back at the place where we've been back to school a little longer than I believe you all have been. And folks are starting to ask, gosh, this has been a hard year for both kids, young people, as well as for the adults. And what if these adults don't want to come back to the system, that it becomes harder to recruit new teachers into the profession? What if folks are just so fatigued by how hard it has been to educate through this pandemic? And maybe we find ourselves in a teacher shortage. So the question I've been asking is, well, how might we redesign the role of an educator for radically different learning? And I use this language, how might we redesign, because it invites possibility. The system or the bridge was once designed one way, and now there might be ways in which we could recreate and redesign the purpose of this next phase of our learning systems. And maybe it's no longer a bridge. Maybe it's jet skis. Maybe it's an airplane. Maybe it's a boat. There's all kinds of ways to get there. And we get to sort of expand our opportunities to think about all the ways in which we might redesign the current system. And in this case, I ask for a radically different learning environment, for radically different learning. We know that, again, what kids have been taught to do, to regurgitate information, to answer tests where you could honestly just Google that information on your phone, that's not actually preparing us for the kind of learning in order to lead and learn and thrive and shape this world as it's evolving around us. And I say educator. In our country, we often use the word teacher, and that suggests a person who stands in front of the classroom, who's trained with a lot of sort of credentials in order to have the right to stand in front of the classroom. And I want to think about an educator, who are all of the adults, who are all of the people who help us shape a young person's learning. And how might we think it more expansively about those combinations of people from different places, from different communities, from different sectors, from different ages, who might all become educators if we start to imagine that a little bit differently than a traditionally trained teacher. So how might we redesign the role of an educator for radically different learning? Before we get any further, I want to invite you to do a little reflection for yourself. What was your most meaningful learning experience? I'm going to give you a little sense of what mine was, at least one that comes to my mind today, and then invite you to do the same. And you can do that in the chat functions or on your own journal. But the question is, what stands out to you as a particularly profound or meaningful learning experience? And for me, one of the ones that I most remember did not actually happen in school. It happened in a summer leadership camp that I went to when I was about 14 or 15. And what I was doing was invited to participate with young people from all across my region. With very different backgrounds. And together we were given a task. It was a simulation. It wasn't a real task, but man, it felt real to us. And they said, pretend you are a company and you have to decide where to put your plant. Where in our state, in our region, are you going to put it? Well, what ended up happening is it became incredibly intense for us to try to, as a group, make this important decision. Because for the kids who came from the city, they felt like, you can't put it in our community because we have historically been displaced and marginalized. There's already so much poverty. This is just going to have an outsized impact on our families. For the kids who grew up in the country, they said, you can't put this power plant by the river because the pollution is going to impact the fish. And all of a sudden, you could see all of these different interests, all of which were right, but created a real conflict for us to try to reconcile coming to life. So what we were learning was, how to make decisions across lines of so many differences and to communicate, to listen, to make hard, consequential choices. And it was really intense. And the way it worked was we were basically set up with a task, and then the adults all stepped back and let us work through it. And we'd work and then we'd learn by doing and making some mistakes and having intense conversation. And then we'd pause, and they would facilitate learning for reflection. How did it go? What was the effect that had? How do you feel about that? What did you notice about yourself? What did you notice about others? So it was really quite profound. And some of the adult friends that I have now today were shaped by that early experience. So, and it happened, by the way, too, on a college campus. So I was not yet in university. And yet I was imagining myself at a setting that was so different from what I experienced when I was back at home. So I want you now to take a moment and ask, what was your most meaningful learning experience? And just as I did, ask yourself, what made it so memorable? What specifically were you learning? Why did that learning matter? With whom were you learning, and what did power look like in that relationship? Where were you when it was happening, and how did this come to life? The last question is about how available was this type of learning for all kids. For me, it was a free program, so we had lots of different backgrounds of kids who were there, but it still only happened for a couple weeks in the summer. It wasn't embedded in a school day, so not everybody had access to it, even if it was free. What I hope you're starting to discover is that learning is happening in lots of different places with lots of different people for lots of different purposes. And where it becomes really powerful is when there's alignment and intentionality brought to it. There's no right or wrong, good or bad. There's lots of answers when we start to dream into what this new bridge can look like, but we have some wisdom from which to draw upon when learning already is working for us. So one of the frameworks we use in the Reinvention Lab is a set of questions that allow us to interrogate why young people are learning, what's the purpose of that learning, what they are learning, how, with whom, where, and how we make sure that that's equitable and available for all folks. So as we get into this next section, keep that frame in your mind. It will help you figure out what is more and less resonant for you. So we're going to move into a section where I'm going to offer 4 pieces of inspiration. These are 4 different organizations in the United States who I think are pushing in interesting ways about the role of an educator in creating radically different learning environments. And so my hope in offering inspiration and provocation for you is not to suggest this is the right answer or you should do what they're doing, but rather to get your juices flowing and say, what about what they're doing is interesting, or prompting me to imagine something different, or even challenging me, or maybe I disagree with it. That's all good. Pay attention to it. That's where we start to imagine different possibilities when we have something sometimes to react to that's different from our day-to-day. So the first group I want to introduce you to is called the Brooklyn STEAM Center in New York. Now, what I love about this place is that it is an actual industrial park where there are hundreds of businesses, and young people go to their own home school. They're like not school at home, but their community-based school, the high school that they would typically go to. And then for a portion of that day and week, they leave that school and they come to this place at the Brooklyn STEAM Center. And the focus of that time is all around innovation, career, and technical training. And so they immerse themselves in actual real businesses and start to learn the kinds of things that are going to enable them to be successful in the careers and jobs that they might want for themselves. So they're doing real work. They're building networks, learning how to be in relationship with others, and getting actual certificates that allow them to be more competitive when they go to apply for these jobs later. It's very, very real world focused. So what's the roles the adults are playing? So what allows them to happen is that because they're working on things like computer science, construction, culinary arts, design and engineering, film and media, they go to the sectors, the field where people do that work already. They love the work that they're doing, and they want to share and bring this in for young people. They're not necessarily trained teachers. So we were now all of a sudden enrolling industry experts in education. Those folks may not have seen themselves as teachers, and yet here they are, serving as incredible educators, shaping our young people. Another group that I find inspiring, this is a new organization called Step Mojo. What if students could benefit from the best of their virtual and in-person learning? So in this new online platform, they offer their classes virtually, but kids get to take it while they're in their school setting. So they choose the classes that best suit them from a catalog of lots of different options. So you might want to take an AP computer science class, or a financial literacy class, or cybersecurity, but your school might not have that at your school. You may not have a teacher who teaches that. Well, here you can sit in your school and get offered that curriculum from experts, who do teach that content. And what that allows us to do is to find adults, some of whom actually oversee the learning environment where you're sitting at your computer and getting this access to this course. But you don't have to be a classically trained teacher to do that. And then you have a lead content teacher who delivers this instruction online, who loves teaching in that format. Okay. Inspiration number 3, One Stone. This is a school in Idaho, and they have really pushed my thinking. Here they ask, what if young people drove more of their learnings and adults supported that? So very specifically, this is a place that has really privileged youth leadership in driving their own learning. In fact, the board is made up of young people. And here you walk into the building and you don't see kids sitting compliant in rows. You see kids selecting and shaping what curriculum they want the teachers to design classes on to influence. They move through the spaces fluidly in different classes that they are set up to drive and choose. They work on their own individual and group projects based on their interests. And the adults in this case are not just teaching them or imparting wisdom into them, they're guiding them and supporting them and figuring out how to help these young people drive exactly what they're learning and how they're learning it. So in this case, the role of the teacher is to guide, not just to deliver content. And so imagine what this starts to look like with who then is qualified to be a teacher and what good teaching looks like. The last example I want to use is one at a university who does teacher preparation. And they're saying, what if we don't have a teacher supply problem, but rather a workforce design problem? And so here, this is a setup of an average classroom of third graders. So what is that? Probably 9-year-olds who have a classroom of one teacher to about 25 students. Now, I've been in a lot of the classrooms in India, and I understand there's often far more students than that for one teacher. But imagine if you took a group of those teachers and said, okay, instead of doing the same thing in each of these classrooms 4 times over, what if instead you imagined it differently, of a team? So you had one of those 4 people who was a lead teacher, 2 of them who were professional teachers. We still value what a traditional teacher can bring, but that frees you up to think now very differently, perhaps about paid teacher residents from the community, community educators, folks who specialize in particular areas of focus or content, people who float back and forth between the different groups. There's so many ways you get freed up to start to imagine the kind of people and what they would do if you don't think about one person as responsible for all of their kids' needs, but rather a group of people working to meet multiple different needs. And the truth is, there's a lot of teaming already happening anyway, but we could staff it and be even more intentional about it. And when you look at other sectors, this is not uncommon. This is a photo from a hospital where it says, who's in my room today? And you can see the ways in which all of these different people are working together to meet your needs as a patient. Similarly, perhaps you could have a team of adults all working together differently to meet your needs as a learner. Okay, so what I'd love to now do is pause and ask, what struck you from this? What stood out to you? What do you love? What are you curious about? What do you disagree with? What makes you inspired or uncomfortable? Let's just pause and take a few minutes. So again, just take stock. What struck you from this initial inspiration? Just engage in a possible extension of this. So the question for you is, if you're having fun with this, how else might you think expansively about what could exist in this second bridge? And what are your own opinions? You've gotten some provocation about how other innovators in the United States have started to answer some of these questions. How would you want to answer these questions? So number 1, why do you think young people should be learning? What's the purpose of education from your perspective? What do you want young people to learn based on that? What would they value? What would they know? What would they be able to do? How might they learn those things? Where would that take place? With whom? And then how do we ensure that this is possible for all kids? So if you're having fun with this, you want to engage in any of the ideas I've offered today, push my own thinking, or offer something back, questions or inspirations, you can reach me at Michelle, Michelle, .Culver Culver, at teachforamerica.org. Thanks so much for jumping in with me, and I look forward to hearing what this sparks. Hope you have a beautiful rest of your day. Bye.